The Hayes Ranch had always been a place of noise, of hoofbeats, barking dogs, creaking gates, and Clara's laughter drifting across the fields like wind through wheat. For years, Samuel Hayes woke before dawn to the familiar rhythm of ranch life, knowing that no matter how hard the work got, his wife would be there with coffee in hand and a smile that steadied his world. But ever since she passed, the ranch had turned mute. The silence wasn't just around him, it pressed in on him, sinking into his bones. Clara had gone into labor a week earlier than expected. There was no doctor within 30 miles, only the town's midwife, an older woman named Agnes Walker, who had helped deliver half the town's children. Samuel had trusted her hands. He had believed, as many men did, that childbirth was a hard road but not a deadly one, not anymore. But during the long night of labor, when Clara's breathing became shallow and her hands turned cold, Samuel realized that some roads still ended in places you couldn't follow. The midwife placed the baby girl in his arms before she said the words that split his life in two. He barely heard the rest, something about hemorrhaging, loss of blood, nothing they could do. All he could see was Clara's still face. She looked as if she were only sleeping, but he felt, in that moment, the world lean away from him. The child cried, but he stood frozen, torn between the life that had just begun and the one that had just ended. The funeral was small. Neighbors came in wagons, bringing covered dishes and awkward condolences. Pastor McKinley said words about faith and suffering, but Samuel didn't hear those either. The coffin seemed too small for someone who had filled so much of his life. When the last handful of dirt hit the lid, he felt his chest go hollow. After the mourners left, he stayed until the sun dipped below the hills, unsure how to walk away from the last place he'd stand with her. In the days that followed, he barely spoke. He fed the livestock out of habit more than intent, moving like a man walking through water. The ranch didn't stop needing him, but he stopped caring if the fences sagged or the hay wasn't stacked. Cattle lowed in the distance. The wind rattled the barn doors. But the sound he heard most was nothing at all. In the house, the silence was worse. Every corner held a memory of Clara, her rocking chair near the fireplace, her half-mended quilt draped over it, the jar of blackberry preserves she'd canned just 2 weeks before. Samuel couldn't bring himself to move anything. Even the scent of her soap still clung faintly to their bedroom. The baby crib sat beside their bed, a gift Samuel had built himself. He had pictured Clara laying the child in it for the first time, humming softly. Instead, he laid the baby there alone, his hands unsteady. The newborn's tiny breaths were soft, barely breaking the stillness. Sometimes, in the dark hours of early morning, Samuel would sit at the edge of the bed and stare at his daughter, unsure whether to feel awe or terror. The nights were the hardest. Sleep came in patches, always interrupted by the baby's whimpers. He would pace the wooden floors with her bundled in his arms, whispering apologies she couldn't understand. The bottle of formula sat on the table, instructions smudged with his thumbprints. He followed them as best he could, trying not to think of how naturally Clara would have done all of it. Every failed attempt reminded him of what he wasn't, her. Though days passed, the clock seemed stuck. Meals went cold on the stove. Letters from relatives stayed unopened. The dogs slept by the porch, confused by the absence of their mistress. Samuel didn't cry at first, not when she died, not at the burial, not when he held their baby alone in the quiet hours. The grief was too heavy for tears. It rested in him like a stone, unmoving. And so, the ranch that had once echoed with life belonged now to silence, a silence that reminded him every moment that he was a husband no longer, yet a father still, and wholly unprepared for both truths colliding at once. Days blurred into nights without distinction, and Samuel Hayes found himself living in a world measured not by sunrises or suppers, but by the cries of an infant and the weight of exhaustion pressing against his skull. The baby, whom he had not yet named, though Clara had chosen names months ago, woke every few hours, day and night. Each wail rattled through the cabin like a warning bell. Samuel tried to keep up with the schedule the midwife had scribbled on a folded scrap of paper before she left. Feed every 3 hours. Burp her gently. Keep her warm. Her instructions were simple enough in ink, but in practice, they felt like commands written in a language he didn't speak. One evening, the wind howled outside, rattling the shutters and stirring dust across the floorboards. He was heating formula in a dented tin saucepan, trying to remember if it should be warm to the touch or just above room temperature. The baby began to cry from her cradle, sharp, hungry cries that built in intensity. He hurried, sloshing some milk onto the stovetop. When he finally brought the bottle to her lips, She turned her face away and shrieked louder. Samuel's hands trembled. He tested the temperature against his wrist like Agnes had shown him, though she'd made it look effortless. When he tried again, she sucked weakly, then stopped. Her small brow furrowed as her cries broke into hiccups. After 10 minutes of coaxing, she managed only a few mouthfuls before drifting off from exhaustion rather than fullness. By the time she quieted, the fire in the stove had died low, and Samuel realized he hadn't eaten since dawn. He reheated the same beans he'd scorched at breakfast, but after a few bites, he pushed the plate away. Food had lost all purpose. Hunger was just another ache among many. Outside, the ranch reflected his neglect. The cattle bawled at odd hours, their feed troughs half filled or forgotten altogether. The horses kicked their stalls in frustration, unbrushed and restless. A section of the north fence had fallen after a storm 2 nights earlier, and though Samuel had seen it from a distance, he couldn't bring himself to mend it. The land had always depended on his hands, but now his hands barely managed the child he held. He moved through each chore like a sleepwalker, his boots dragging through the dirt. Once, he found himself standing in the barn with a pitchfork in hand, staring at a pile of hay as if he'd forgotten why he was there. The sounds of the ranch, the clink of buckets, the shuffle of hooves, once familiar, now felt foreign, as though the land no longer recognized him. At night, the baby's whimpers became cries, and cries became screams. Some nights, she refused the bottle entirely. Samuel, desperate, tried rocking her the way he remembered Clara once doing with their niece. He held her against his shoulder and patted her back, murmuring nonsense just to fill the silence. Her head was so small against his chest that he was afraid to breathe too deeply. When she finally slept, he stood for a long time before daring to lay her in the cradle, terrified she would wake the moment he let go. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and always interrupted. Some mornings, he woke in the chair by the fire with the baby still in his arms, unsure if he'd ever made it to the bed. His beard grew untamed, his clothes hung loose, and the mirror in the washroom reflected a face he barely knew, eyes sunken, shoulders bowed, hair uncombed. He looked like a man twice his age, hollowed out and worn thin. His neighbors, though far, had noticed his absence at Sunday service and in town. A few sent letters, 1 or 2 rode out and left food or quilts at his porch without knocking, unwilling to intrude. But Samuel never opened the door while they were there. He didn't know what to say. How does a man explain that the loudest thing in his world is his own helplessness? One afternoon, he tried to fix the gate that was hanging off its hinge, but the baby cried from inside the house. He dropped the hammer and ran, heart pounding as though danger were near. She had only startled herself awake, but he held her tightly, chest heaving. The gate remained broken. So did he, though he didn't have the words for it. As each day ended, the same thought haunted him with growing certainty: he was not enough, not for the ranch, not for the baby, and not for the life Clara had left him to carry alone. And though he did not yet know it, the darkest night was still ahead, and with it, a moment that would bring everything to its breaking point. The night that nearly broke him began like all the others, quiet at first, then steadily unraveling. A pale moon hung over the ranch, casting thin light through the gaps in the shutters. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, and Samuel sat hunched in a wooden chair, his head drooping forward as sleep tugged at his eyelids. The baby lay in the cradle beside him, wrapped in a quilt Clara's mother had sewn before the wedding. For a brief moment, all was still. Then the crying started. It wasn't the usual soft whimper or startled fussing. This cry was sharp, panicked, as if hunger itself had found a voice. Samuel jolted awake, his heart thudding in his chest. He reached down and lifted the baby, her tiny fists flailing, face red with effort. He murmured her name, the one Clara had chosen, Emily. It was the first time he'd said it aloud since the day she died. The name tasted like both love and loss in his mouth. He crossed the room to the table where the bottle lay empty. He had meant to fill it earlier, but fatigue had stolen his memory. Setting Emily against his shoulder, he rummaged for the tin of formula. The small cloth measuring scoop slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. He swore under his breath, picking it up with shaking hands. He poured the powder too quickly, spilling some onto the table. His vision blurred with exhaustion, and for a moment, the room tilted. He had to steady himself on the edge of the counter. Emily's cries grew louder, more frantic, each wail piercing through the fog in his mind. He could almost hear Clara's voice scolding him gently, showing him the right way to do things, the calm way she would have soothed their child. By the time he added water and set the bottle into the warm pot on the stove, Emily was choking on her own sobs. He tested the temperature and sat down with her in the rocking chair, whispering broken reassurances. But when he offered the bottle, she turned away, her cries taking on a desperate edge. She was too hungry to focus, too worked up to latch. "Please," he whispered, voice cracking. "Just try." He shifted her in his arms, tried again, but she screamed harder, stiffening her tiny body in resistance. Panic prickled through him like needles. He bounced her, patted her back, walked the length of the room and back again. Nothing helped. Minutes stretched into an hour, and then longer. His ears rang from the sound of her crying. Sweat gathered at his brow despite the cold night air. His legs ached from pacing, his arms from holding her so tightly. At last, overwhelmed, he sank to his knees in the center of the floor. The bottle slipped from his grasp and rolled under the chair. He held Emily close to his chest, pressing his cheek to her head, and for the first time since Clara's death, he broke. The tears came hot and sudden, blurring everything. He didn't sob loudly, he couldn't, but his body shuddered with each quiet breath. Emily continued to cry, but her voice was growing hoarse. The sound of her hunger cut deeper than any grief he'd known, deeper even than watching Clara's grave disappear beneath the soil. "I can't do this," he whispered into the darkness. The words were barely sound, more like breath escaping a wound. "I can't. I'm not enough. I don't know how." The room swam with shadows. The fireplace offered no warmth. The world beyond the walls felt impossibly far away, and the isolation, once merely heavy, now became suffocating. Emily's cries slowed to ragged, trembling breaths. She was exhausted. So was he. He rocked in place on the floor, holding her close, staring at the doorway as though expecting someone, anyone, to walk through it. But no one did. There was no family nearby, no hired help, no doctor to call. Just the dark and the sound of his child's weakening whimper. He stayed there until the first hint of dawn touched the window. His back ached, his eyes burned, and his arms were numb from holding her. The bottle still lay on its side, untouched. The ranch outside remained unaware of the storm unfolding inside its walls. In that moment, truly and terribly, he believed he was failing, not as a husband, but as a father. And failure, he feared, might cost him the only piece of Clara he had left. What he didn't know, what he couldn't yet imagine, was that before the next night fell, the silence would be broken not by despair, but by a knock that would change everything. The sun had barely risen when Samuel finally laid Emily in her cradle. She'd cried herself into a fitful sleep, her breaths uneven and shallow. His arms felt like dead weight, his mind like a frayed rope ready to snap. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing, the silence around him now worse than the crying had been. He hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time in days, and the night's desperation still clung to him like mud. His shirt was damp with sweat, his hair uncombed, his eyes hollow. When he caught his reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin, he barely recognized the man staring back. He tried to stand, meaning to fetch more wood for the fire, but his knees nearly buckled. Instead, he sank into the wooden chair by the cold fireplace and closed his eyes. Just for a moment, he told himself. Just to rest them. He wasn't sure how much time had passed when the sound came, 3 firm knocks on the front door. At first, he thought he'd imagined it. No one came out this far unannounced, and certainly not this early. He waited, listening. Then, again, knock, 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 steady, purposeful. Emily stirred in her cradle, letting out a soft cry. Samuel forced himself to stand and cross the room, his boots dragging on the floorboards. He hesitated at the door. Some part of him, the part that still clung to pride or caution, considered ignoring it. But the knocks came once more, patient and certain. He pulled the door open. Standing on the porch was Maria Thompson, a widow from a neighboring ranch nearly 6 miles away. She carried a cloth-wrapped bundle under one arm and held a small tin pail in the other. Her dark hair was pinned back loosely, wisps blowing in the wind, and her expression was calm but searching. "Morning, Samuel," she said, her voice gentle but firm, as though she'd practiced it on the way over. Samuel blinked, trying to gather words. "Maria. What?" "I know it's early," she interrupted softly. "I came to return Clara's roasting pan. She lent it to me before everything happened." Her voice caught slightly, but she steadied it. She lifted the bundle to show the polished pan wrapped inside. He stared at it a moment, unsure why something so ordinary suddenly felt like a memory carved in stone. "I would have sent one of the boys," she continued, "but I thought I should come myself." Samuel opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a weak cry sounded from inside the house. Maria's eyes flicked past him and narrowed with quiet concern. "That the baby?" she asked. He nodded, slow and ashamed. She don't sleep long." Maria stepped forward, her brow furrowing as she took in his unshaven face, the dark circles under his eyes, and the state of the room behind him. "Samuel, you look worn to the bone." "I'm managing," he muttered, though the lie tasted bitter. Maria didn't argue. Instead, she held out the tin pail. "I brought fresh goat's milk. My niece's baby took it fine when she couldn't nurse. Figured it might help if the store-bought stuff ain't sitting right." He stared at the pail like it was something holy. Another cry came from the cradle, sharper this time. Before Samuel could move, Maria stepped past him into the room. She set the pan down on the table and walked to the baby with the ease of someone who had done this before. She lifted Emily gently, supporting her head and murmuring soft words that seemed to settle the child almost instantly. Samuel stood frozen in the doorway, unsure if he was relieved or embarrassed, or both. Maria glanced at him over her shoulder. "You got a pot clean?" He hesitated, then nodded and fetched one without question. In minutes, she had warmed the goat's milk and filled a bottle. She tested it on her wrist before sitting in the rocking chair and letting Emily latch. The baby drank, slowly at first, then hungrily, her tiny hands relaxing at last. Samuel watched, every muscle in his chest loosening in a way he hadn't felt since Clara died. Maria didn't speak right away. She simply rocked, fed the child, and let the silence settle, this time, not empty, but comforting. Only when Emily finished and drifted into a quiet sleep did Maria look back at him and say, "You don't have to do this alone, Samuel. Not anymore." For the first time in weeks, he believed that might be true. The day Maria Thompson stepped through the door, something in the house shifted, not loudly or suddenly, but like a draft of warm air easing through a long-sealed window. After Emily finished feeding and fell asleep in Maria's arms, a quiet unlike any Samuel had felt in weeks settled over the room. Not the hollow, suffocating silence of grief, but the kind that follows a storm, when the land is still and breathing again. Maria laid Emily gently in her cradle, tucking the quilt around her with practiced hands. Samuel stood there, unsure whether to thank her, apologize, or collapse. His voice finally emerged, rough as gravel. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." Maria didn't reply with pity. Instead, she pulled a chair out from the table and nodded for him to sit. He hesitated, then lowered himself into the seat. His arms hung at his sides, too tired to fold. She took the pail to the basin and rinsed the bottle without being asked. When she turned back, she spoke plainly. "You're grieving. And you're raising a newborn in the middle of it. That would break most men quicker than you've broken." Something in him nearly came undone then, but he held it back. "I keep thinking Clara would have done this right. She would have known how to feed her, how to soothe her." "She would have had hard nights too," Maria said. "But she would have had help. And so will you." He looked at her then, really looked, at the lines carved by years of work and loss, at the steady way she held herself, at the quiet assurance in her eyes. "I didn't ask you to come." "I didn't come because you asked," she said simply. "I came because you needed someone. And because Clara would have done the same for me." She stayed for several hours that morning. She cleaned the bottle and boiled fresh water. She checked the stove, added firewood, and set a pot of oats to cook for him. When Emily stirred, Maria lifted her with the ease of a woman who'd raised younger siblings and tended to nieces without complaint. "Before leaving," she said, "I'll come back tomorrow with more milk. And some cloth diapers if you need them." Samuel started to protest, but she cut him off with a look firm enough to quiet argument. She tied her shawl, slung the empty pail over her arm, and stepped onto the porch. Just before she descended the steps, she paused. "You don't have to thank me," she said, turning slightly. "Just don't close the door the next time someone knocks." She walked away down the dusty path, her figure shrinking under the rising sun. Samuel stood in the doorway long after she was gone, unsure whether the tightness in his throat was grief or relief. That night, he fed Emily with goat's milk warm the way Maria had shown him. She drank without crying. After she slept, he managed a full bowl of the oats she'd prepared and even lit the lantern to check on the horses before bed. He was still tired, more than tired, but not drowning. The next morning, the knock came again. This time, he opened the door without hesitation. Days turned into a rhythm. Maria didn't move in or take over, she simply showed up when she could, bringing what she had: milk, advice, quiet strength. Some days she stayed only an hour. Other days, she walked the fields with him while Emily slept in a sling she'd sewn herself. She taught him to burp the baby properly, to hold the bottle at the right angle, to warm blankets before wrapping her. She spoke of her own late husband only once, and after that, he didn't ask. The ranch slowly began to wake again. The horses were brushed. The cattle were fed on time. The broken gate was mended with Maria holding the nails while Samuel hammered. The cradle, once a reminder of all he'd lost, became a reminder of what still needed him. Though Clara's absence lingered, it no longer swallowed every corner of the house. Emily began to sleep longer, cry less, and one morning, she wrapped her small fingers around Samuel's thumb with such fierce trust that he felt something in his chest, something long dormant, stir back to life. He still had miles of grief ahead, but he was no longer walking them alone. And all of it began the moment he was too broken to stand, until someone knocked, and hope entered quietly through the door.